The massive training ship GDA Starforge drifted through space like a metal city among the stars. Inside its corridors walked cadets from 47 different worlds, each species hoping to earn their place in the Galactic Defense Alliance. Most cadets followed the rules, studied hard, and treated their fellow trainees with basic respect. Cadet 13 was not like most cadets, standing 8 feet tall with dark green scales covering his muscular frame. The Vorthik, known as Cadet 13, had earned his numerical designation through pure trouble. His real name was buried somewhere in disciplinary files. It grew thicker each month. The Academy staff found it easier to simply call him by his cell number from his first detention. Commander Zelta sat in her office, reviewing the latest reports about 13. The four-armed Nexari officer had dealt with difficult cadets before, but nothing quite like this. Her orange skin showed stress patterns as she read through incident after incident. Destroyed equipment during training exercises. Fights in the dormitory. Theft of food rations. The list went on for pages. The Vorthik species were known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors. Their homeworld was a harsh place where only the strong survived. Pack mentality ruled their society, with the biggest and meanest taking whatever they wanted. These traits made them excellent soldiers in battle, but terrible students in a mixed species academy. 13 had taken these natural instincts and twisted them into something ugly. He saw the academy not as a place to learn, but as a hunting ground where he could establish himself as the top predator. Smaller species became his targets. The gentle plant-like Vergani wilted when he approached. The crystalline shard people avoided common areas when he was around, but his favorite victims were the Feline. The Feline were small, cat-like beings with soft fur and large eyes. They stood barely 4 feet tall and weighed less than a human child. Their species had joined the Alliance as communication specialists and engineers, bringing advanced technology and peaceful intentions. They were also perfect targets for a bully like 13. The latest incident had happened just 2 days ago in the main dining hall. 3 young Feline cadets sat at their usual table, quietly eating their evening meal. 13 had approached them with his usual swagger, his heavy footsteps making the metal floor vibrate. The Feline looked up with wide, frightened eyes as his shadow fell across their table. "Move," 13 had growled in the common tongue, his voice like grinding stone. "This is my table now." The 3 Feline started to stand, ready to give up their seats as they had done many times before. But another Feline cadet had seen what was happening. Her name was Kira, and she was one of the few of her species brave enough to speak up against injustice. "No," Kira had said, her voice small but determined. "They were here first. Find another table." 13 had turned his massive head toward her, his yellow eyes narrowing with anger. In Vorthik society, any challenge to authority had to be answered with violence. He reached out with one clawed hand and grabbed Kira by her fluffy tail, lifting her off the ground. "What did you say, little cat?" he hissed, dangling her in the air. Kira cried out in pain as his grip tightened on her sensitive tail. The other Feline at the table whimpered, but were too scared to move. The dining hall had fallen silent. Cadets from dozens of species watched the scene unfold, but none dared to interfere. 13 was too big, too mean, and too willing to hurt anyone who crossed him. They had learned through experience that helping his victims only made things worse. 13 enjoyed the fear he saw in every face around him. This was how things should be. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak submitted or suffered. He shook Kira slightly, making her gasp in pain. "Maybe I should teach you some manners, little cat," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Maybe you need to learn what happens when you talk back to your betters." Only the arrival of security officers had ended the confrontation. They had forced 13 to release Kira and escorted him to detention. But everyone knew he would be back. He always came back, and each time he got bolder. Commander Zelta closed the file and rubbed her temples with two of her hands. The political situation made everything more complicated. The Vorthic Confederation provided thousands of troops to the Alliance military. They were valuable allies in the ongoing war against the Krogan Empire. Expelling their cadet could cause diplomatic problems, but keeping 13 at the academy was becoming impossible. His behavior was getting worse, not better. The other cadets lived in constant fear. Several promising students from smaller species had already requested transfers to other training facilities. If this continued, the academy would lose its reputation as a place where all species could learn together. A soft chime from her desk communicator interrupted her thoughts. Her aide, a nervous Centaurian named Vex, appeared on the screen. "Commander," Vex said, his antenna twitching with excitement. "We just received word from Alliance Command. Earth has been accepted as a member world. Their first cadet will arrive next week." Zelta blinked in surprise. She had heard the stories about humans. Of course, the species that had somehow defeated an entire Krogan battle fleet, despite having no advanced technology. Most people thought the reports were exaggerated. A primitive species from a backwater planet could not possibly be that dangerous. "What do we know about this human cadet?" she asked. Vex checked his notes. "His name is Jake Sullivan. Former military. Officer from their armed forces. He requested special accommodation for a non-sentient companion animal. A pet?" Zelta's eyebrows rose. "What kind of creature?" "The file says it is called a cat. Small carnivorous mammal, approximately 12 pounds. Apparently, it is emotionally important to the human." Zelta shook her head. First, she had to deal with a violent Vorthic who terrorized other students. And now she was getting a human who wanted to bring his pet to military academy. She wondered what other surprises this assignment would bring. Meanwhile, in the detention center, Cadet 13 sat on his narrow bunk and stared at the metal walls. He was not worried about punishment. They would lecture him, maybe assign extra duties. But they would not expel him. They needed the Vorthic too much for that. He thought about the new human who would be arriving soon. 13 had heard the stories too, but he did not believe them. Humans were small, weak creatures from a primitive world. They would make perfect targets, even easier than the Feline. The Vorthic smiled, showing his sharp teeth. Soon he would have a new victim to establish his dominance over. This human would learn quickly that 13 was the apex predator on this ship. Everyone did, eventually. Outside the ship, stars wheeled slowly past the observation windows. Soon those stars would witness something that would change everything about life aboard the Starforge. But for now, they kept their ancient silence, waiting for the arrival of a human and his small, furry companion. The transport shuttle docked with the Starforge at exactly 1400 hours, Galactic Standard Time. A small crowd of Academy staff and curious cadets gathered in the main hangar to witness the arrival of Earth's first representative. Expected to see something impressive, perhaps a towering warrior or a being with obvious signs of the deadly skills that had supposedly defeated the Krogan Empire. Instead, Jake Sullivan stepped off the shuttle, looking remarkably ordinary. He stood about 6 feet tall with brown hair and calm blue eyes. His build was average for a human, neither particularly large nor small. He wore a simple gray uniform and carried a standard military duffel bag over one shoulder. In his other hand, he held a rectangular carrier made of some kind of mesh material. Academy. Director Thorne, a distinguished Centaurian with silver fur and kind eyes, stepped forward to greet the newcomer. His species were known for their diplomatic skills and had served as peacekeepers throughout the galaxy for centuries. "Welcome to the Starforge, Cadet Sullivan," Thorne said, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting he had studied. "We are honored to have Earth's first representative join our academy." Jake shook the offered hand with a firm grip. "Thank you, Director. I'm glad to be here. And please, just call me Jake." The casual tone surprised many of the watching cadets. Most new arrivals were nervous or tried to impress the staff with formal speeches. This human seemed completely at ease, as if he visited alien space stations every day. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" Thorne asked, glancing curiously at the carrier Jake held. "Long but smooth," Jake replied. "Buster here slept most of the way." He lifted the carrier slightly, and the assembled crowd could see movement. Inside, a low rumbling sound emerged from within, like a small engine running. "Ah, yes, your companion animal," Thorne said. "We have prepared special accommodations as requested. I must admit, we were uncertain about allowing a pet aboard the station." Jake's expression grew slightly more serious. "With respect, Director, Buster isn't exactly a pet. Where I come from, the bond between a soldier and his animal companion is considered sacred. He's been with me through 3 combat deployments. We're a team." Before Thorne could respond, Jake knelt and opened the carrier. A large orange cat emerged, stretching each leg carefully before sitting down and surveying his new surroundings. Buster was impressive for a house cat, weighing at least 12 pounds with thick fur and bright green eyes. He looked around the hangar with the calm confidence of someone inspecting property. He already owned Dot. The reaction from the watching cadets was immediate and varied. The Feline representatives moved closer, their ears perked up with obvious interest. Their cat-like features made the resemblance to Buster clear, though they walked upright and possessed higher intelligence. Several of the larger species stepped back instinctively, unsure how to react to this small predator. "He's beautiful," whispered one of the Feline cadets, a young female named Mira. "He looks like the ancient pictures from our homeworld." Buster's ears swiveled toward the sound of her voice, and he fixed her with a steady green gaze. After a moment, he stood and walked directly to her, brushing against her legs once, before returning to Jake's side. The simple gesture caused excited chittering among the other Feline. "He likes you," Jake said to Mira with a smile. "Buster's always been a good judge of character." Director Thorne led them on a tour of the academy facilities. Jake listened politely to explanations of the training programs, dining schedules, and dormitory assignments. He asked intelligent questions about the curriculum and showed genuine interest in learning about the different species represented at the academy. Buster followed at Jake's heel like a well-trained soldier, but his eyes were constantly moving. He cataloged every sight, sound, and smell with the focused attention of a predator mapping new territory. Several times he stopped to investigate interesting scents or to claim sunny spots near observation windows by sitting in them briefly. The tour ended at the dormitory level, where Jake would be sharing quarters with cadets from several different species. As they walked down the corridor, they encountered Cadet 13 emerging from his room. The massive Vorthik had been waiting for this moment. He positioned himself directly in the center of the hallway, using his 8-foot frame to block passage. His yellow eyes gleamed with anticipation as he looked down at the much smaller human. "So you're the famous human," 13 said, his voice carrying the grinding menace that usually made other cadets flee. "You don't look like much to me." Jake stopped walking and looked up at the reptilian giant, without any sign of fear or intimidation. "You must be 13. I've heard about you." His tone was conversational, as if he were commenting on the weather. This was not the reaction 13 expected. Other cadets either cowered or tried to appear tough when he confronted them. This human seemed genuinely unconcerned by the threat he represented. "Have you now?" 13 growled, leaning down to bring his massive head closer to Jake's eye level. "And what have you heard?" "That you're the biggest troublemaker on the station," Jake replied calmly. "That you pick on smaller cadets and generally make life miserable for everyone around you." He paused, considering. "Must be exhausting, having to prove yourself all the time." The comment hit 13 like a physical blow. No one had ever suggested his behavior showed weakness rather than strength. Before he could respond, his attention was drawn to movement at Jake's feet. Buster had stepped forward and was now sitting directly between Jake and 13, looking up at the massive Vorthik with complete calm. The cat showed no fear, no aggression, just steady evaluation. His green eyes fixed on 13's face with the unwavering focus of a predator studying potential prey. Something deep in 13's brain began sending warning signals. Every instinct developed over millions of years of evolution was telling him that this small orange creature was dangerous. Not dangerous like a weapon or a larger predator, but dangerous in a way he could not quite understand. "That's Buster," Jake said, reaching down to scratch behind the cat's ears. "He's curious about you. Cats are like that with new people. They like to figure out what makes someone tick." Director Thorne, who had been watching the encounter with growing concern, decided to intervene. "Perhaps we should continue the tour," he suggested diplomatically. "Cadet Sullivan needs to get settled in before the evening meal." Jake nodded and picked up his duffel bag. "Nice meeting you, 13, he said to the still frozen Vorthik. "I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other." As Jake and the director continued down the corridor, Buster remained sitting for a few more seconds, his gaze never leaving 13's face. Then, with the casual indifference of someone who had seen enough, the cat turned and padded after his human. 13 stood alone in the hallway, his mind racing. For the first time in his life at the academy, he had encountered someone who neither feared him nor challenged him directly. The human had treated him like a mildly interesting obstacle, nothing more. But it was the cat that truly disturbed him. Those green eyes had looked right through him, evaluating and dismissing him as if he were no more threatening than a piece of furniture. 13 had faced down Krokan warriors in battle simulations. He had dominated every other cadet who dared to cross him. But something about that small orange predator made his scales itch with unease. Later that evening, during the communal meal, Jake sat with a mixed group of cadets from various species. He answered their questions about Earth and human culture with patience and humor. Buster lay contentedly under the table, occasionally accepting small offerings of food from the curious aliens. From across the dining hall, 13 watched and tried to understand what he was seeing. The human showed no signs of the dominance behavior 13 expected from a warrior species. Yet other cadets were already treating Jake with obvious respect, seeking his opinions and laughing at his stories. Even more confusing was how the Feline cadets reacted to Buster. They had overcome their usual timidity to approach Jake's table, drawn by their fascination with his feline companion. The cat seemed to enjoy their attention, purring loudly when they petted his fur and showing none of the aloof behavior typical of predators. As the meal period ended, 13 made his decision. Tomorrow, he would establish proper dominance over this human and his strange pet. Every new cadet learned eventually that 13 ruled this station. The human would be no different, regardless of whatever reputation had preceded him. But as he left the dining hall, 13 caught sight of those green eyes watching him from beneath the table and felt that strange unease return. For reasons he could not explain, he had the uncomfortable feeling that tomorrow might not go as planned. Within 3 days of arriving aboard the Starforge, Buster had claimed more territory than most cadets managed in their entire training period. The orange cat moved through the station's corridors with the confidence of someone who had always belonged there. He chose the best sunny spots near the observation windows, claimed the warmest areas near the heating vents, and established favorite perches on equipment that gave him clear views of all activity. What surprised the Academy staff most was how other cadets reacted to the cat's territorial behavior. When Buster settled in a corridor, even the largest species would automatically walk around him rather than force him to move. When he claimed a seat in the common areas, no one questioned his right to be there. The small predator had established dominance without a single act of aggression. Jake watched his companion's behavior with amusement and pride. Buster's always been good at reading a room, he told Cadet Myra during one of their conversations. The young Feline had become fascinated by the cat and spent much of her free time learning about Earth felines from Jake. He reminds us of the old stories, Myra said, her large eyes bright with curiosity. Before our people developed space travel, we had legends about the great hunters who could move unseen and strike without warning. Buster carries himself like those ancient warriors. Jake nodded. Cats are apex predators, even the domestic ones like Buster. Millions of years of evolution went into making them perfect hunters. They don't need to prove it to anyone because they know it in their bones. This conversation was overheard by several other cadets, including 13, who had taken to following Jake and Buster from a distance. The Vorthik was struggling to understand what made the human and his companion so different from every other being he had encountered. The breaking point came during the 4th day in the Academy's main gymnasium. The facility was used for combat training, physical conditioning, and martial arts practice. Different species trained at different times to accommodate their various physiologies and fighting styles. 13 had been using the gymnasium for his own purposes, turning it into another hunting ground where he could corner smaller cadets without interference. On this particular afternoon, he had trapped Kira, the brave Feline who had stood up to him in the dining hall several days earlier. "You think you're brave, little cat?" 13 growled, backing Kira against a wall of training equipment. "Let's see how brave you are when there are no security officers around to save you." Kira's fur stood on end with fear, but she refused to show submission. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her voice shook slightly. 13 laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You should be. Your species are prey animals, soft, weak, born to be hunted. I'm going to teach you what happens when prey forgets its place." The Vorthik raised one massive clawed hand, preparing to demonstrate his point with violence. But before he could strike, a new presence entered the gymnasium. Buster padded silently through the doorway, his green eyes immediately assessing the situation. The cat took in the scene with the quick evaluation of an experienced predator. Large aggressor threatening smaller victim. Victim backed against obstacle with no escape route. Aggressor focused entirely on victim and unaware of new arrival. Buster processed all of this information in seconds and acted, moving with liquid grace. The cat positioned himself directly between 13 and Kira. He sat down calmly, wrapped his tail around his paws, and fixed the massive Vorthik with an unwavering stare. No hissing, no arched back, no obvious threat display. Just the steady, measuring gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. 13 froze in place as every warning system in his brain began screaming. This small orange creature radiated danger in a way that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to millions of years of genetic memory. The cat's eyes held the same cold calculation 13 had seen in the deadliest Kraken warriors he had faced in battle simulations. "What are you doing?" 13 demanded, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "This doesn't concern you, animal." Buster's response was to narrow his eyes slightly, his pupils dilating to black circles. His ears flattened back just enough to change. His silhouette from domestic pet to wild predator. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of hunters. 13 found himself unable to move forward. Every instinct told him that approaching this creature would trigger a response he was not prepared for. The cat was small, barely 12 pounds, but something about its absolute stillness spoke of coiled violence ready to explode into action. "Buster, there you are." Jake's voice cut through the tension as he entered the gymnasium. He took in the scene quickly, his eyes moving from the terrified Feline to the frozen Vorthik to his cat sitting calmly between them. "I was wondering where you had gotten to." Jake walked over and knelt beside Buster, scratching the cat behind the ears. "Making new friends?" he asked conversationally. Buster purred loudly, but never took his eyes off 13. "This animal is interfering." "With Academy business," 13 said, trying to regain his authority. "Remove it immediately." Jake looked up at the massive Vorthik with mild curiosity. "Business? What kind of business involves cornering a cadet half your size in an empty gymnasium?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. 13 realized that his position was difficult to defend. He had been caught in the act of bullying, and now he had to deal with a human who showed no fear and a cat that somehow projected more menace than he did. "The weak must learn their place," 13 said, falling back on Vorthik philosophy. "It is the natural order." Jake stood up slowly, his expression growing more serious. "You know what's interesting about natural order? Real predators don't need to prove themselves by picking on creatures that can't fight back. That's not hunting. That's just bullying." He gestured toward Buster, who was still maintaining his steady watch over 13. "Take Buster here. He's killed more prey than you've probably seen in your entire life. Mice, rats, birds, insects. He's a killing machine wrapped in soft fur. But you don't see him running around, terrorizing creatures smaller than him for sport." Jake's voice took on an edge that made several cadets who had gathered at the gymnasium entrance step back. "You want to know what makes a real predator? It's not size or aggression. It's the absolute certainty that when the moment comes, you can do whatever needs to be done." Buster weighs 12 pounds, but every creature on this ship recognizes him as a threat because he moves like one. 13 felt the truth of those words like a physical blow. He outweighed the cat by more than 20 to 1, but there was no question which of them projected more danger. The cat sat with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never doubted their ability to handle any situation. "The difference between you and Buster," Jake continued, "is that he doesn't need to terrorize innocents to feel powerful. He knows what he is. You're still trying to convince everyone, including yourself." For the first time in his life, 13 experienced doubt. His entire worldview was based on the idea that strength came from dominating others. But this small earth creature challenged that belief simply by existing. Buster had established himself as the apex predator on the station. Without raising a claw in anger, Jake helped Kira to her feet, checking to make sure she was unharmed. "You okay?" he asked gently. The young Feline nodded, still shaken but grateful for the intervention. "Come on, Buster," Jake said to his companion. "Let's let 13 think about what we discussed." The cat stood up slowly, stretched each leg carefully, and gave 13 one final evaluating look. Then he turned and padded after Jake with the casual indifference of someone who had seen enough to make his judgment. 13 remained frozen in place long after they had gone. Around him, other cadets began to whisper among themselves. Word of the confrontation would spread quickly through the station. For the first time since arriving at the academy, the mighty Cadet 13 had been faced down by a house cat. But what disturbed 13 most was not the embarrassment or the damage to his reputation. It was the growing realization that everything he thought he knew about strength and dominance might be wrong. And if that was true, then he would have to completely rethink who he was and what he wanted to become. That night, 13 lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Somewhere on the station, a small orange predator was probably curled up in a warm spot, completely at peace with his place in the world. 13 envied that certainty more than he had ever envied anyone's size or strength. News of the gymnasium incident spread through the Starforge faster than a computer virus. Within hours, every cadet on the station had heard some version of the story. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core truth remained. Unchanged, Cadet 13, the most feared bully in Academy history, had been stopped cold by a 12-pound house cat. The reaction among the student body was immediate and profound. Cadets who had lived in terror of 13 for months suddenly found themselves walking taller. The Feline students, in particular, seemed to shed years of accumulated fear overnight. If a small earth cat could face down the mighty Vorthik, perhaps. They were not as helpless as they had believed. 13 himself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Other cadets watched him carefully, looking for signs of weakness or changes in behavior. They whispered when he passed in the corridors and fell, silent when he entered common areas. But instead of the usual fear in their eyes, 13 now saw something worse. Pity. The proud Vorthik warrior had become an object of sympathy, reduced from apex predator to failed bully by a creature that weighed less than his breakfast. The humiliation burned worse than any physical wound he had ever received. Unable to sleep or focus on his studies, 13 began following Jake and Buster from a distance. He told himself he was looking for weaknesses, planning his revenge. But deep down, he knew he was trying to understand something that challenged everything he thought he knew about power and dominance. Jake's behavior continued to puzzle him. The human treated everyone with the same casual respect, from the smallest Feline to the largest Centaurian. He never raised his voice, never used his military rank to intimidate others, and never seemed to need to prove his superiority. Yet other cadets sought him out constantly, asking for advice and hanging on his every word. During tactical exercises, Jake demonstrated a completely different approach to leadership than anything 13 had seen before. When assigned to lead mixed species teams, the human never barked orders or demanded obedience. Instead, he asked questions, listened to suggestions, and somehow made every team member feel like their contribution was vital to success. The key to human military tactics, Jake explained to a group of cadets during a study session, is that we don't try to overpower our opponents. We try to outthink them. We make them make mistakes, then we exploit those mistakes. 13 lurked at the edge of the group, pretending to read a training manual while listening to every word. He did not understand how thinking could be more powerful than strength, but the results spoke for themselves. Jake's teams consistently outperformed units led by larger, more aggressive species. On Earth, Jake continued, our apex predator isn't the biggest or strongest animal. It's us. We're persistence hunters. We chase our prey not until it gets tired, but until it makes a fatal error in judgment. Mental exhaustion is far more dangerous than physical exhaustion. Cadet Vex, a nervous Centaurian, raised his hand. But how do you make an enemy make mistakes? Jake smiled. You give them what they expect to see, then you do something completely different. Most species rely on size and aggression to win fights. They expect their opponents to either run away or meet force with force. When you respond with intelligence, instead of violence, it confuses them. Confused enemies make bad decisions. The lesson was interrupted by an alarm that echoed through the station. All cadets to battle stations, came the announcement. This is a training exercise. Repeat, this is a training exercise. The cadets scrambled to their assigned positions as the lights dimmed to combat levels. This was one of the Academy's most challenging simulations, designed to test how well mixed species teams could work together under pressure. Random teams were assigned, and 13 found himself grouped with Jake, two Feline communications specialists, and a crystalline shard engineer .13, expected to take command automatically. He was the largest, strongest member of the team, and Vorthek tradition demanded that he lead. But when he opened his mouth to give orders, Jake was already speaking quietly to the other team members. "All right, people, let's see what we're dealing with," Jake said, studying the tactical display. The simulation showed their small ship under attack by multiple enemy vessels. "Lynn, Kira, I need you to monitor all communication channels and watch for patterns in enemy coordination. Dev, can you reroute power from non-essential systems to boost our shields?" The team members responded immediately, each focusing on their specialized skills. 13 stood uncertainly, waiting for someone to acknowledge his authority. When no one did, he tried to assert himself. "I should be leading this mission," 13 declared. "I have the most combat experience." Jake looked up from the tactical display without any sign of irritation. "You're absolutely right about the combat experience. That's why I need you handling our defensive strategy. Can you analyze the enemy attack patterns and tell us the best way to position our ship?" It was not the response 13 had expected. Instead of challenging his authority, Jake had given him a vital role that used his actual strengths. For the first time in his academy career, 13 found himself being valued for his abilities, rather than feared for his aggression. As the simulation progressed, 13 watched in amazement as the team worked together like a single organism. The Feline cadets used their natural stealth abilities to gather intelligence on enemy movements. The shard engineer rerouted power systems with crystalline precision. Jake coordinated everything with quiet efficiency, making suggestions that somehow became unanimous decisions. When enemy fighters broke through their defenses, 13 found himself automatically moving to protect the smaller team members, rather than seeking glory for himself. His size and strength created a defensive barrier that allowed the others to work without fear. For the first time, he experienced the satisfaction of using his power to protect rather than dominate. The team's ship not only survived the simulation, but achieved the highest score of any group that semester. As they left the combat center, Jake clapped 13 on the shoulder in a gesture of genuine appreciation. "Good work in there," Jake said. "You've got excellent tactical instincts. Ever think about specializing in defensive strategy?" The casual praise hit 13 harder than any insult ever had. No one had ever complimented his intelligence before, only his physical capabilities. The idea that his mind might be as valuable as his muscles was completely foreign to Vorthik culture. That evening, 13 found himself in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars and trying to process what he had experienced. He was so lost in thought that he almost did not notice when Buster padded into the room and settled down near one of the large windows. The cat began his usual routine of grooming and territory marking, but something about his presence was different. Tonight, instead of the predatory evaluation 13 had grown accustomed to, Buster seemed almost peaceful. The orange feline cleaned his fur methodically while watching the stars drift past outside. After an hour of shared silence, 13 made a decision. That would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He moved slowly to a spot about 6 feet away from the cat and sat down on the floor. He did not try to pet or interact with Buster. He simply shared the space and the view. Buster paused in his grooming to look at 13 for a long moment. Then, apparently satisfied with what he saw, the cat returned to his routine. It was a small gesture, but to 13, it felt like acceptance from the one being on the station whose opinion truly mattered. As the hours passed, 13 began to understand what Jake had been trying to teach him. Real strength was not about making others fear you. It was about being someone others could depend on when things got difficult. It was about protecting rather than dominating, building up rather than tearing down. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Cadet 13 fell asleep, feeling something other than anger or frustration. Curled up on the observation lounge floor with a small orange cat nearby, he dreamed of becoming someone worthy of the respect he had always demanded but never earned. The transformation of Cadet 13 did not happen overnight. Old habits and instincts, carved deep by years of aggressive behavior, fought against his growing understanding of what real strength meant. But the foundation had shifted, and slowly, day by day, the massive Vorthik began to change. Jake noticed the difference first. Instead of the hostile stalking he had grown accustomed to, 13 began approaching him directly with questions. The conversation started awkwardly, with 13 struggling to express concepts that had no equivalent in Vorthik culture. "Why do you not command?" 13 asked one afternoon as they stood in the training simulator room. "You have the skills to lead, but you ask instead of ordering. On my world, the strong take control. They do not request permission." Jake considered the question carefully while adjusting the simulation parameters. "Commanding and leading are different things," he said finally. "When you command, people follow because they have to. When you lead, they follow because they want to. Which kind of followers do you trust more in a real fight?" The question haunted 13 for days. He began watching the dynamics between different cadets more carefully, noting how Jake's quiet suggestions carried more weight than direct orders from academy instructors. Other cadets sought Jake's advice voluntarily, while they obeyed 13 only when forced. The real test came 3 weeks later during the academy's most challenging exercise, a week-long survival simulation that required cadets to work in mixed teams while facing increasingly difficult scenarios. 13 found himself assigned to a team that included Kira and 2 other Feline cadets, along with representatives from 4 other species. The old 13 would have immediately established dominance through intimidation and force. The new 13 found himself uncertain how to proceed. When the team gathered for their first planning meeting, he stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, unsure of his role. 13, said Kira, her voice showing only slight nervousness. "You know more about combat tactics than any of us. What do you think our defensive priorities should be?" It was the same approach Jake had used during their first simulation together. But coming from one of his former victims, it carried extra weight. Kira was offering him respect and authority, while making it clear she expected him to earn both. "We need to establish a secure perimeter first," 13 said slowly, his voice lacking its usual aggressive edge. "Then we identify escape routes and communication points, but—" He paused, struggling with concepts that felt foreign to his nature. "I think we should hear everyone's ideas before making final decisions." The simulation proved to be the most difficult challenge any of them had faced. Their team was dropped on a hostile planet with limited supplies and told to survive while completing a series of objectives. Wild predators stalked them through alien forests. Environmental hazards threatened their equipment. Enemy forces hunted them with advanced technology. Through it all, 13 found himself falling naturally into a protective role. When Feline team members used their stealth abilities to gather intelligence, he positioned himself to provide cover for their retreat. When the smaller cadets needed rest, he took extra guard shifts without complaint. When their engineer needed time to repair vital equipment, 13 held defensive positions that would have challenged an entire squad. But the most important change was how he treated his teammates. Instead of seeing the Feline as weak prey animals, 13 began to appreciate their unique skills. Their ability to move silently through undergrowth proved invaluable for reconnaissance. Their small size allowed them to access areas larger species could not reach. Their keen senses detected threats long before anyone else noticed danger. "You were right," 13 said to Kira on the fourth night of the simulation as they shared watch. "Duty. I used to think strength meant making others fear you. But real strength means making others feel safe." Kira looked up at the massive Vorthik with surprise. In the months she had known him, 13 had never spoken to her without menace in his voice. "What made you change?" she asked quietly. 13 was silent for a long moment, staring up at the alien constellations overhead. "A cat," he said finally. "A small orange cat who showed me what a real predator looks like." When the simulation ended, their team had achieved the highest survival rating and mission completion score in Academy history. But what impressed the instructors most was not their technical success, but the way they had worked together. Video analysis showed 13 consistently putting the welfare of his teammates above his own safety and comfort. Word of 13's transformation spread through the Academy as quickly as news of his original bullying had. Cadets who had lived in fear of him began approaching cautiously, testing whether the change was real. They found a Vorthik who still possessed all of his physical power, but had learned to use it as a shield rather than a weapon. The real validation came from an unexpected source. Buster, who had maintained his watchful distance since their first encounter, began showing up wherever 13 spent time. The cat never approached directly, but his presence became a constant. He would claim sunny spots near where 13 studied, or settle down for grooming sessions within sight of where the Vorthik ate his meals. One evening, as 13 sat alone in the observation lounge working on tactical homework, Buster padded into the room and surprised everyone by jumping onto the table where 13 was working. The cat settled down on top of 13's notes, purring loudly, and began cleaning his fur. "I think that means he approves," Jake said from the doorway where he had been watching the interaction. Buster's pretty selective about who gets his attention. 13 looked down at the cat, hardly daring to breathe. Slowly, carefully, he reached out one massive scaled finger and gently scratched behind Buster's ears. The purring grew louder. "He is teaching me," 13 said quietly. "Every day I watch him. He never needs to prove he is dangerous because he knows it completely. He protects those smaller than him, not because he is weak, but because he is strong enough to choose protection over dominance." Jake nodded, settling into a nearby chair. "That's the difference between a predator and a bully. Predators hunt when they need to eat. Bullies hunt because they're afraid of being hunted themselves." The Academy graduation ceremony took place 3 months later. 13 stood with his class, wearing the insignia of a junior officer and the special commendation for leadership excellence. His transformation had become legendary among the Academy staff, proof that even the most difficult cadets could change when shown the right example. As Director Thorne called his name, 13 walked across the stage to receive his commission. In the audience, Jake applauded alongside cadets from dozens of different species. Many of them were Feline, who had learned to see 13 not as a threat, but as a protector. Buster watched the ceremony from his favorite perch near a sunny window, grooming himself with typical feline indifference to the human pageantry below. But when 13 glanced in his direction, the cat paused in his cleaning to offer a slow, deliberate blink, the feline equivalent of approval. After the ceremony, 13 sought out Jake one final time before their assignments took them to different parts of the galaxy. "Thank you," the Vorthik said simply. "You and Buster showed me what I could become instead of what I was." Jake smiled and extended his hand for a final handshake. "You did the hard work. We just provided the example." As 13 boarded his transport to his first real assignment aboard a frontier defense vessel, he carried with him lessons that no military academy textbook could have taught. His crew would include several Feline communication specialists, and He had specifically requested them. Where once he would have seen prey animals, he now saw valuable teammates whose unique abilities complemented his own strengths. The Vorthik, who had once terrorized smaller species, now served as their shield against the dangers of deep space. And somewhere in the galaxy, a human and his orange cat continued their own adventures, leaving behind them a trail of changed lives and transformed perspectives. The Predator had learned the most important lesson of all. True power protects the pack. It does not prey upon it. And that lesson, taught by 12 pounds of orange fur and green eyes, would echo through 13 service for the rest of his career.